Hi, this is Fluid Restriction Self-Management in Heart Failure Patients. This project is by Jade Epler, Ashley Erickson, and Abby Keith from MICC 6 South at St. Luke's on the Plaza. Our PICO question is, in heart failure patients on a fluid restriction, does providing a method for patients to track their own fluid intake lead to better outcomes in heart failure treatment compared to patients who rely on the healthcare team to track their fluid intake for them while in the acute care setting? Our population would be patients with heart failure on a fluid restriction in an acute care setting, and obviously patients who have the mental capacity to participate. Our intervention would be providing some type of method for patients to track their own fluid intake. We all agreed that the first thing we would need to do is establish a set time frame for 24-hour intake that is kept consistent through all patients, whether it's 7 to 7, midnight to midnight, or the past 24 hours at any given point. Current confusion over this first step is already causing both patients and nurses frustration over keeping track of fluid intake and causing inaccurate documentation. The next easiest thing to do would be to provide a piece of paper that can easily be used to keep track of fluids that the patient and nurse can work on together. The patient could include most used fluid amounts, such as the piece of paper that we all already have in our badges. The nurse can then help the patient do conversions, as well as add in any amounts of fluid going in through the IV, fluid that is often forgotten. Our comparison group would be patients who do not participate in tracking of their own fluid intake, and instead depend on the care team to track their fluids for them. A finding that was not expected while doing the research for this project were several studies that called into question the efficacy of fluid restrictions themselves. While this was very interesting, this is an entirely separate topic to explore, which is why our outcomes are limited to more short-term outcomes, such as better compliance with their fluid restrictions, more accurate I's and O's, better estimates at net diuresis, and increased education and confidence at tracking fluids at home at discharge.
On MICC 6 South, a majority of our patients have congestive heart failure, and many of these patients are in the hospital for treatment of acute CHF exacerbations. Typically, they're there diuresing, and most of them are on a fluid restriction, which is normally 1.5 to 2 liters of fluid intake per day. Every day, we work with patients who are currently prescribed to fluid restriction, and in this experience, we've discovered that patients often have a difficult time staying compliant with them for a number of reasons. The first reason Ashley mentioned in the previous slide, which is there's not a clear time set for when their fluid restriction allotment restarts. Some nurses might say from one morning to the next, while others say from midnight to midnight. Another reason can be that the patient never received proper education on heart failure and the important lifestyle modifications to manage it. A third reason can be a lack of motivation on the patient's part to stick to their fluid restriction, or simply because they're too thirsty. Lack of compliance with their fluid restriction and other lifestyle modifications can lead to worse outcomes and an increased number of hospitalizations, which is why we wanted to address this question.
The first article we'll be discussing is titled Isolating the Benefits of Fluid Restriction in Patients with Heart Failure. This is a pilot study, so the group of people with heart failure is a little bit smaller. The NYHA class is 2 to 4. So this study was compiled in 2 different groups, a control group and an EBI group. And EBI is Educational and Behavioral Intervention. So this group of people received a specific education on their heart failure and how fluid restrictions would be beneficial and how to comply with those fluid restrictions. And they were also given boundaries and tips on how to be successful at home. So the results were that the EBI group, had a decrease in heart failure symptoms and frequency, such as edema, and they also reported overall improvement in quality of life. They did still complain of increased thirst and discomfort caused by thirst, and this was a complaint in both groups. But overall, they did find that fluid restrictions were beneficial to people with heart failure, and if they received the education and ways to be successful at home, that they did experience fewer heart failure symptoms.
Our second article is titled Fluid Balance Monitoring in Congestive Heart Failure Patients in the Hospital, a Best Practice Implementation Project. This article had to be classified as a C level of evidence due to its method of a pre- and post-intervention design. Since with this type of study design you are not randomizing your groups, it cannot be classified as a level B. This study took place on a cardiac floor. Their intervention included using additional education for patients and families to ensure that they understood the importance of fluid restrictions and why they were measuring intake in the first place. They also used fluid charts to increase patient involvement and ensure better accuracy by the nurses and care staff as well. When auditing charting and surveying patients and care staff post-implementation, they found that compliance and estimated accuracy went up significantly in all areas surveyed when compared to before their intervention was implemented. These results are very promising to our proposed change in practice.
Our third article is titled Patients' Experiences of Using a Consumer Health App for Self-Management of Heart Failure, a Mixed Methods Study. The level of evidence is a C because it utilizes qualitative data from participant interviews and ratings to track the results. The purpose of the study was to determine the effectiveness of a smartphone app for self-management of heart failure. This app was developed by a team of clinicians, patients, and caregivers, and has several functions including but not limited to tracking fluid intake, daily weights, doctor's appointments, current medications, and symptoms. For our PICA question, we're focusing on the results from the study specific to the fluid tracking function of the app. The data supported that the fluid tracking part of the app was one of the most used features and improved the accuracy of fluid tracking for some participants. In the post-intervention interviews, one participant stated, quote, "The most beneficial feature for me at this point in time is the fluid intake. The fluid counter is excellent. I love it. Absolutely love it." Another participant shared, quote, "I don't record it as such, but I check it every couple of days, keeping a mental note. I just want to make sure there are no big variations from day to day, so that's all I look for. But with the app, it's nice to have that trend. I like it. It gives you a more accurate picture." We liked the idea of an app because almost all people carry smartphones with them most of the time. Patients could use an app while at home as well as when they're in the hospital. The study did find that a lack of technological literacy was a significant barrier for some participants. In this case, the standard paper flow sheet would be recommended. We found that easily accessible health apps, such as MyFitnessPal, already has fluid tracking functions. This is an alternative option that we could suggest to patients with smartphones who are looking for easier ways to track their intake.
So some helpful recommendations that we have for people with fluid restrictions. One of them, first of all, would be when they should be tracking their fluids. Of course, they should track anything that they ingest, but the time. So midnight to midnight we felt would be the best time, because if they get up at, say, 2 or 3 in the morning, we know a lot of times with heart failure, they do have to use the restroom in the middle of the night. So if they get a drink, they, well, I may as well get a drink while I'm up. How often do we hear them say that? So it would be easier to just write down a number and not even have to worry about tallying it, because then when you wake up for breakfast, your number's right there. Just add it to what you drink for breakfast. So midnight to midnight we think would be the best time to establish while they're in the hospital. Also making them a part of their own healthcare team. This would be, just keeping them involved is especially important for making them feel included, that they're not just a patient being treated, but that they're included. We want their input. We want their involvement. This may also cause some accountability, so we know when they go home that they're going to continue with these good habits that they've hopefully established this hospitalization. Also, giving them a fluid intake flow sheet we think would be a good starter for starting habits. Even if they don't keep the flow sheets when they go home, just doing an app on their phone, or just keeping a notepad at their bedside would be helpful. And this is also would be the best time to be answering their questions, helping them find on cans of soda or on milk cartons, showing them where the total volume of fluids they're drinking is located on the carton, and helping them to tally that up. Also, of course, including the nursing assistant, because, who else is going to be giving them fluids? Well, it won't just be the nurses, it's the nurse assistants as well. So letting them know, hey, there's a flow sheet in their patient room, could you please help them just write it down and help them tally that when they're in the rooms as well. And we also think there are, like I said before, there are different ways to track fluids. So there are a lot of apps. Many people nowadays have smartphones, and there are so many different apps to track, calories and workouts and things like that. Well, there are a lot of apps that also track fluid intake. There's MyFitnessPal or MyPlate that's recommended by the CDC, MealVisor, or my personal favorite is called Waterlogged. So these are just some ways that we can help them while they're in the hospital, and hopefully setting them up for success to continue to track fluids when they go home.